So we're going to, obviously we're going to run out of time, so we'll be starting now, so we're 15 minutes late. So in this session, we have performances, talks, presentations about disturbing performances, performances that are too long, performances that are too close, so where the performers are too close to you, and performances where we don't know how to respond because the performers are perceived to have intellectual disabilities. So the first paper, I'm going to introduce very quickly each speaker. First speaker is Karen Shimakawa, who's the Chair of Performance Studies in the Tisch School of Arts at New York University, and adjunct instructor at the New York University School of Law, which I guess must be a relatively unusual combination. And her paper is called Being a Sign, Performative Discomfort, and we'll go straight in.
So my paper considers the productivity of discomfort, both performances of discomfort and performances at discomfort, and the affective impact of proximity. I'm interested in how performances of nearness, especially nearness to non-hegemonic difference, can elicit dis-ease, a sense that I argue can be politically and aesthetically generative. When I submitted my abstract, I focused exclusively on one aspect of this problematic, that is the relation between proximal performances of difference. Okay. All right, thanks. Is that it? All right. So when I submitted my abstract, I focused on one aspect of this problematic, that is the relation between proximal performances of difference and the discomfort they generate, and how that discomfort is negotiated in U.S. law, which is like its specialty. But it has since expanded to consider the aesthetic function, which is part of my larger project. So this is going to be a bit of a mashup, but I think it might speak actually more directly to some of the concerns of the conference as a whole, and I hope you'll bear with me. Okay, so in Infinitely Demanding, Simon Richelieu argues that discomfort is a condition to which we are all vulnerable, simply by being in the world. Tracing the work of Levinas, Kant, Badiou, and Lacan, he argues that the ethical subject is essentially the subject defined by what he says is a fidelity to an unfulfillable demand, close quote. And as such, the ethical subject is that which exists in discomfort. So I've been tracking this discomfort in law for some time now, that is in the ways that U.S. law manages discomfort, specifically the eruptions of discomfort incited by the nearness of difference. So just briefly, I'll mention one example, and I'm happy to talk about it afterwards with you if you're interested. The case that got this whole project started is called Monaghan versus Pomona Valley Community Hospital, a 1991 U.S. employment discrimination case in which a Filipina assistant head nurse was demoted for refusing to comply with a no Tagalog rule, Tagalog being the dominant language spoken by those native to the region of the Philippines from which she and many of her co-workers had immigrated. The rule being imposed on her by the board of on her board by the hospital was specifically in response to the complaint of a non-Tagalog speaking employee who reported feeling uncomfortable in the hearing presence of Tagalog. The district court ruled in favor of the hospital, despite findings that neither patient care nor business efficiency had been impaired. The court ruled that the hospital's no Tagalog rule was not discriminatory because it aimed at addressing what was admittedly a deeply divisive work environment in which the non-Tagalog speaking employee perceived herself to be a victim of favoritism. The court did not reach a finding on whether favoritism had taken place, but was satisfied that a language restriction was an appropriate course of action as an amelioration of the non-Tagalog speaker's discomfort. It's this performance of closeness, the in-your-faceness of certain kinds of difference that disturbs. And what these kinds of legal cases suggest to me is that there is something like a constitutional or paraconstitutional right in the U.S. to not be disturbed or discomforted in this particular way. It's important, I think, that the wording of the federal statute on employment discrimination tracks the language of the 14th Amendment, jurisprudence which bars discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, religion, and national origin. So one question that's got me thinking about is whether U.S. constitutional law actually does protect something like a right to comfort based on hegemonic conformity. In a longer version of this project, I'm also trying to think about this through Jean-Luc Nancy's formulation of being singular plural and being in common as possible ways of explaining the repeated agonistic engagements with minoritarian difference we seem to be mired in the US at least, and the ways that something like being in common and the requirements of a nation state, or perhaps law more broadly, are fundamentally incommensurable. People are strange, Nancy reminds us, and perhaps nothing throws that in our faces more than the prospect of the immigrant other, performing her immigrant otherness. The project is also a conversation with Jose Munoz's notion of the utopia performative, the happy/mad counterpoint to my mad/happy project, as he once put it. And actually, just as an aside, I actually would, if you're, this is thinking about Avital's thing about the friend and the kind of thing, both the impossibility and the unavoidability of the friend. And I think that if you wanted to trace that further, you might check out Jose's book on the utopian performative, because he's trying to think that through, exactly that, what to do with friendship. Okay, so, but Jose and I never got to play that conversation out as planned, so here I want to come back to the Richelieu quotation I started with, and really it's actually a very small point in Richelieu's book about the productivity of discomfort. In the face of this potentially existential discomfort, that ethical being is structurally incommensurable with social relationality, Richelieu suggests a like performative response. He says, I am proposing an ethics of discomfort, a hyperbolic ethics based on the internalization of an unfulfillable ethical demand. Ray Tirada grapples with a similar dilemma, in her words, of the fact-value convergence, which she derives from Kant. She says, we are, quote, under some pressure from every received fact to agree on not only the ontological weight of the fact, but also the value assigned to the fact. Not merely what is it, but simultaneously and synonymously, what does it mean? The normative pressure to confirm agreed upon valuations of facts is unavoidably coercive. As a result, she argues, the subject longs for relief, which may be found in the practice of what she terms phenomenophilia. And this is her talking, looking away at the colored shadow on the wall, or keeping the head turned to the angle at which the sunspot stays in view. This is her again, looking away, which is the title of her book, where particularly ephemeral experiences, perceptions that seem below or marginal to normal appearance, figure the possibility of fleeting relief from the pressure to endorse what Kant calls the world as is, close quote. So for Tirada, looking away can't stop the pressure of the fact-value convergence altogether, but it is a strategy of momentary deferral by recourse to aesthetic practice. In other words, I'm suggesting that something like an aesthetic engagement with the proximal performance of difference might be a way of not only relieving the burden of the fact-value convergence, or Critchley's ethical but impossible demand, it might actually allow us to bear that burden, the burden of being singular plural, but bear it a little differently. I know that's a little bit of a jump, but this is a condensation of a much longer argument, so I hope that you'll just jump with me. But I think this is actually related to the figure of the gestural pause that Judith Butler was talking about yesterday. And I'd love to hear your thoughts afterwards. Okay, so here, I want to briefly turn to the aesthetic. That is, by considering, I'm only going to get to one, recent play by Japanese playwright Toshiki Okada. Okada is the founder and director of Tokyo-based theater company Shellfish, and he is most closely associated with their productions, but in the past few years he has embarked on collaborations with Philadelphia theater artist Dan Rothenberg and his company Pig Iron Theater. In 2010, Rothenberg directed an English translation of a play Shellfish had premiered in Japanese in 2006, which was titled Enjoy. Actually, in Japanese it was Enjoy also. That collaboration, which also actually includes an amazing translator, Aya Ogawa, led to a second collaboration beginning in 2011, this time not only with Rothenberg, but his company, Pig Iron. The second collaboration, which was titled Zero Cost House, premiered in Philadelphia in September 2012. That's what I think I'm probably going to get to, but I'll talk to you about later if you want. Rothenberg's production of another Okada Sonic Life of a Giant Tortoise is currently running in New York, and if for some reason you're going to be there in the next few days, I highly recommend it. Okay, so Enjoy's subject matter is announced in the program note. In 2006, the Japanese Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare published a white paper reporting that although the flaccid Japanese economy was finally starting to improve, quote, the number of part-time workers, freelancers, contracted employees, temps, short-term employees, and others who fall outside of conventional economic standing has drastically increased, creating a diverse work environment, but also decreasing regular employment, and this denormalized work climate continues to grow. Close quote. So the bursting of the Japanese economic bubble in the early 1990s reshaped the normative trajectory for a wide swath of Japanese youth. And the ministry worries, quote, long-term part-timers were seen as unlikely to hold on to jobs for a long time, lacking in career ambition, and a generation of young people, quote, not in employment, education, or training, aka NEET, are now growing older. The report goes on to warn that these workers will not be able to catch up with their younger competitors on the job market and are in danger of stalling out, thus creating a drag on the national economy. So Enjoy set in a comic book cafe in Tokyo's entertainment district, and it portrays two sets of employees, three men in their 30s, who fall squarely in that NEET category, and a cohort of 20-somethings who are just out of college. The younger workers have leapfrogged the older guys to middle management, and the central precipitating event is Mizuno, one of the 30-somethings, breakup with his long-term girlfriend, who is similarly underemployed as an office temp worker. With scant prospects for career advancement, Mizuno drifts along until a childhood acquaintance happens to stop in for lunch, fully employed and dressed in a suit. The two men recognize each other, but awkwardly avoid acknowledging as much. This sends Mizuno into a self-pitying funk that ultimately leads to his breakup. So this seems like a relatively straightforward, poignant, if infuriating, and mercilessly accurate snapshot of the NEET generation as described in the program notes. Now here's where it gets interesting. Here's the opening of the play, and sorry if you subjected to my acting yesterday, you're going to get a little bit more of it today, and I'm sorry. It's actually more appropriate to this script. Okay, so Act 1, staff at a Mongo Cafe. Actor 1, and the characters are named actors and actresses 1 through 5, wanders out on stage and stares quizzically at the audience for a while as if he accidentally went through the wrong door and found himself on a random theater stage. That's actually my description of the production. It's not, there are very few stage directions in the script. Actor 1 says, we'll begin with Act 1. This guy, Kato, was riding the subway the other day. He was riding the KO line, and he had an encounter then when he sat next to, there were these two women who were talking, but Kato had no intention of eavesdropping at all, of course, but while he was listening, to be honest, from the middle of the conversation, it did turn completely into eavesdropping, but you know how for text messaging, when they have those screen stickers that you put on your phone to keep your screen hidden from the person standing next to you? Well, there aren't such things for voices, so in a way, it's a little like too bad, you know? Which may be like totally an excuse, but with that conversation, it was a little like, no matter how you look at it, the voices were clearly above and beyond what is the standard volume. I mean, come on, was the way it seemed, and that was because, but on top of it, the content of the conversation itself was also like, would have piqued anyone's interest in this, but never mind about that story. I mean, we'll get to it later. Let's just put it aside for now. So I have to tell the story about what happened before he got on the train, when he went to the bathroom at the station. I mean, it's not like I have to, but do you mind? Now, if you're familiar with Okada's work, you'll recognize right away, even despite my terrible acting, that this is sort of the style in which his characters tend to work. The proliferation and instability of diegetic levels, the fluid relationship between character and actor, eventually that guy talking about Kato becomes Kato, and then the guy who's telling the story becomes Kato, and you just have to sort of figure it out contextually. Okada describes that the aimless narrative style, which Okada describes as hyperreal, are a through line in most of his work. Okada's characters are chronically bad storytellers. It's not just that they can't finish a sentence, let alone a story. This excerpt is composed of either one or two sentences, depending on how you count the punctuation. But it's more than a case of bad grammar, as they often, as Actor 1 did here, deliberately set aside one story in favor of another one. We never get to the story of the girls on the train, except maybe obliquely. And Kato's bathroom story, which we do hear in excruciating detail, never goes anywhere either. There's a lot more I could say about the sort of the wandering narrative of his work, but in other words, I'm arguing that Okada has created a text that narratologically resists fact-value convergence. And I should say the story about the 30-somethings is one that Japanese audiences would recognize and hook into immediately. It's something that for a while was in the newspaper all the time. Everyone was sort of lamenting what we're going to do about the needs and all this kind of stuff. So it's a very recognizable, potentially a very recognizable and identifiable narrative. But it continually resists a fact-value convergence. You don't really learn anything about these people. Stories go nowhere, actors refuse to remain in character, etc. And by mounting the production with non-Japanese actors in New York, the idiomatic sort of hipster slacker English, Rothenberg and his actors cast our gaze even further aside so that we're not allowed to sink into a comfortable, ethnographically correct depiction of contemporary Japanese life. In fact, I go so far to say that the American production is in some ways more effective than the shellfish version, at least in performing the disconnect or asideness of the bodies and the words on stage. I'm going to skip a little bunch here. Okay. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about a second play and then try to wrap it up. Okay, but while that conventional fact-value convergence is in the end inescapable and enjoyed, despite itself, it kind of makes sense by the end. And I should say, in New York, when I saw it, audiences just streamed out of the aisles. In fact, somebody actually puked the first night, but I'm sure that was not related. But it did not go over well with American audiences, which is why I like it, apparently. Zero Cost House, on the other hand, is even less sure of its inevitability. I would argue that this is in part because it was conceived to be performed by American actors, in part because, and also in part because the two central figures in the play are Okada himself and Henry David Thoreau, and also in part because midway through the writing of the play, Japan was hit with the Fukushima earthquake and tsunami and nuclear disaster. As devastating as that last one was and continues to be for people all over Japan, it seems to have had a really profound effect on Okada, perhaps giving him larger license to linger over that sideways look or strategy. Much messier than his last several works, Zero Cost House exacerbates the distinction between actor and character by moving closer to and further from his aesthetic of hyperrealism. I didn't know where the parentheses closed. Okay. So it begins, as most of Okada's works do, not unlike the last one I mentioned. An actor shuffles on stage, almost accidentally, and then asks us, okay, so may I begin? But unlike his other works, where that fourth wall breaking move functions to invite us to look away from seeing the actor as a fictional character, this time he, Dito van Rijgersburg, was the actor's name, so, not Japanese, he continues. So, all right, I guess I should talk about, well, first of all, who am I? I think, so, I'd like to introduce myself, but my name is Toshio Okada. Where do I come from? I'm Japanese. So this is the only play in which to date, well, up until that point, that Okada had portrayed actual named characters. In fact, almost all of them have real counterparts. Okada's manager, a cultural critic, provocateur named Kyohei Sakaguchi, Okada as a young playwright just beginning his own career, and of course, Thoreau. So Toshiki presents Zero Cost House to us, or Okada presents Zero Cost to us in a disconcertingly straightforward way, a seemingly short circuit of that fact-value loop. He tells us, tonight you're going to see one of the plays I've written, and this is my latest work. What is this play about? Well, if I had to explain it, it's basically an autobiography about one person, me. Later, Sakaguchi describes a photography exhibition / best-selling book he published, documenting the modern day Thoreaus of Japan, homeless people who have created sustainable and affordable accommodations and communities for 0 yen. I'm going to skip ahead, but what's interesting about that is that Sakaguchi is a real guy, and his book was actually published and quite popular, and it was a documentation of people who were basically living off the grid in Japan. So there's more to say about this play, a lot, but for our purposes, I just want to focus on the way the play uses the bodies and affects of the American actors to push against the very strong pull towards a fact-value convergence in reading the recognizable Japanese figures. Okada exacerbates this further by blending the depiction of real events with some that might present themselves as historical, but then are revealed as fiction. So for instance, following a rather pointed conversation between Okada and his manager, Okada turns to us and asks, I wonder if you get it. In other words, I was portraying what I imagined if my manager were that disgusted by me and laughed. In reality, my manager is much more understanding of me, I think. So he would never give me such attitude, like he just couldn't accept what I was doing. Perhaps the most striking instance of this comes at the place, and after Sakaguchi has established his new government on Kyushu. He really did, he went to Kyushu and said he was going to start his own country. And Okada, and to see from Japan. And in the play, Okada has moved there to be his speechwriter. Okada's manager then informs us, ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of the play, which was the autobiography of Toshio Okada. But, ladies and gentlemen, not everything in this play occurred in real life. For example, Okada is not Sakaguchi's speechwriter. Okada is a playwright. That's the end of the play. Okada and Rothenberg bring the incongruity of proximal difference to the fore throughout the play, both diegetically and through casting, only to forcefully turn our heads away to the shadow on the wall, only in turn to remind us that the shadow we're looking at is a shadow of a shadow, both more and less functional as fact-value convergence. So in the larger project, I want to see these works as examples of performance work that might, in the law cases as well, as examples of performance work that might model for us ways of engaging productively with proximal difference, in ways that are both discomforting and pleasurable. The colored shadow on the wall perhaps might tell us something about that real object that casts its shadow, or teach us how to see that object as shadow, and one that might be cast differently. So, I'm going to just stop there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Karen. We'll have questions at the end. So, the next paper is by Tony McCaffrey, who is an experienced actor, director, playwright from the UK, France, Turkey, the US, and New Zealand, where he now is. And he's completed a PhD in Theatre and Film Studies at the University of Canterbury. That's a funny slip. I'm from Canberra, that's a terrible admission. New Zealand is that funny little country on the side of Australia. Australia-New Zealand banter. Anyway, his paper is called How Are We Supposed to Respond? The Presence of Performers Perceived to Have Intellectual Disabilities, Interrogating Ethics and Spectatorship in Contemporary Performance. Tony.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you. Near the beginning of Jérôme Bell's Disabled Theatre, Julia Heusermann from Theater Horror comes to the microphone. She gives her name and her age, and she says, Ich bin Schauspielerin. Julia Heusermann walks out on stage. Behind her are 11 seats and 11 bottles of water. She goes up to the microphone on a stand, downstage centre. She adjusts the microphone to fit her height, and she places it just in front of her mouth. Throughout this sequence of actions, her eyes are cast down. Her eyes continue to be cast down as she speaks for the first time. Mein Name ist... She makes a series of gestures with both hands. It is a movement sequence in, I think, 6 parts. I struggle to reproduce it. Is it an interruption of her act of speech, a not quite formed act? Is it one of the meanings of gesture which Judith Butler spoke about yesterday? Although I must admit I listened to her, but I was also taken with the way Judith Butler herself was gesturing, in the sense of the somatic gestures she was making as she spoke about gesture. She was eloquently gesturing. For me, Julia's gestures are also eloquent. Once she has completed this gesture or movement sequence in 6 parts, she says, Julia Heusermann. Does her calling herself by her own name lead to her forgetting about herself, as Catherine Malabou spoke of, again, very beautifully, very eloquently, when she said, when I call myself as I call out to my cat, Is it to forget about myself, to escape myself? Is it different for Julia? Is it different because she has Down syndrome? Is Down syndrome indicative of intellectual disability? Karen Gaffney, who has Down syndrome, has just been awarded a PhD in the United States. Is a PhD indicative of intellectual disability? Perhaps that's neither a joke nor a syllogism. Is it different for Catherine Malabou to refer to the animal or herself as an animal than if Julia Heiserman were to do so? In positing or questioning differences between people with and without intellectual disabilities, are we in the realm of the ethical or merely in a state of ethical confusion? Who is we in that last sentence? I would now like to cite Avital Ronell, and I must admit that I'm citing that when she was talking off the cuff. She says, what happens to ethics when you're faced with a debilitated subject? What happens to ethics or in ethics when it is made to confront the debilitated or exhausted or fucked up or drugged out or stupid or stupefied so-called subject, the vegged out? What do you do with ethics if, and the dumbed down, mentally deficient, when of course everyone is? I like the way her sentence structure runs out or goes back on itself, embodying syntactically the awkwardness of the subject, as this is speaking that I am citing, not writing. I must admit to at first feeling very uncomfortable at referring the idea to Julia Heiserman or the other members of Theatre Horror, or of back-to-back theatre from Geelong in Australia, or of different light theatre, people with whom I've worked for 10 years, as debilitated subjects. But Avital Ronell's lovely list, the exhausted, fucked up, drugged out, stupid, stupefied, the vegged out, the mentally deficient, which of course everyone is, indicates just how reflexive the name-calling of intellectual disability is. Except for many people, it is a name-calling which is backed up by powerful institutions, excluding and oppressive and stigmatizing and marginalizing mechanisms in the medical, the educational and the juridical domains and discourses. Mein Name ist, beautiful gesture sequence, Julia Heiserman. Then an amplified male voice from the side of the stage. My name is Julia Heiserman. The translation, the traduction, the traducing, the interpolation. I call myself, now I'm called by another. The interruption to the flow of thought and action, which was already difficult enough in the glare of the lights and the gazes, the train of thought now derails. Mein Name ist. Julia then shakes her head from side to side, repeating, She puts her hand behind her head and then holds her head with both hands, saying forcefully, Ich bin 20. The male voice, who has not repeated the second Mein Name ist, then says, I am 20. Julia continues, Und ich bin Schauspielerin. The voice says, and I'm an actress. She turns away from the microphone and goes back to the seats upstage. She holds her head in one hand, her gaze directed to the floor, and then moves her head around uncomfortably, shaking it from side to side. To return to the gesture or gesture movement sequence before Julia names herself, a 6-part sequence which I struggle to reproduce. I remember on first viewing feeling a mixture of discomfort for her, for me, for the audience, for theatre, but also, and more powerfully, a feeling of captivation. The movement was so surprising, an elegant combination of the staccato and the fluid, the intense and the gentle, a kind of exploration in miniature of Laban's effort dynamics, a kind of Grotowskian river of plastiques around the articulatory points of the lower arm, wrist and hands. Possibly it was a psychological gesture as well. Julia was conducting herself, composing herself to ease the anxiety of naming herself. The gesture reminded me of other people I've worked with. Damien Buman, who when we were on tour in Sydney, started to make a gesture like this. The same kind of sequence of quick and slow, jerky staccato and soft fluid movement. It also reminded me of Stephen Kramer, a largely non-verbal dancer diagnosed with autism with whom I have worked, and who has a habit of making sudden fluttering movements, like butterfly wings. For me, in New Zealand, this movement comes in a context of the Māori gesture called the wiri, a Māori kapahaka, or ceremonial performance. The wiri is a movement which can symbolise shimmering waters, heat waves, or even a breeze moving the leaves of a tree. Captivating gestures. When, however, I asked Damien about the gesture, he said that he was afraid of heights and water. We were in Sydney Harbour, staying in an area high above the harbour called the Rocks. Stephen's caregiver informed me that he only made these gestures, the wiri gestures, when he was highly anxious. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders tells me that these stereotyped and repetitive motor mannerisms are known as stimming, stimulating, and are associated with anxiety and efforts to remain calm. Whether they are a symptom of anxiety or an attempt to alleviate it is not made clear, but nonetheless a number of people are medicated to reduce stimming. When I am captivated by Julia's gesture, is she in fact not waving, but drowning? Perhaps there is a way of understanding this gesture beyond either the romanticism and even the colonialism of my initial perception and the pathologizing of behavior of the DSM in Catherine Malabou's notion of plasticity. What might be termed misperformances by people with intellectual disabilities, an averted gaze, a stimming gesture, departures from the expectations or normativities of stance, vocalization, an inability or disinclination to keep to linear narrative or linear time in performance. These supposed wanderings are still neurons wiring and firing. Perhaps people perceived to have intellectual disabilities plasticize performance, receiving, giving, exploding. Then more than ever it may be that intellectual disability is in the eye of the beholder, to a large extent socially constructed, as the neurons are still wiring and firing, only in different configurations. The other way in which plasticity may be relevant is in the response of people with intellectual disabilities to the constraints of performance, which up until now have always been imposed upon them, or performance has been facilitated for them, or given to them by people without intellectual disabilities. Is it Jérôme Bell's disabled theatre, or Théâtre Horror's disabled theatre? Is Julia's compelling uncomfortableness in the short sequence of giving her name, age and profession because of the constraints of performance, or the lack of clarity of what it is she's meant to be performing? At the very start of the performance event, disabled theatre, we hear a person sitting to the side of the stage behind a sound desk who speaks into a microphone and introduces himself. Good evening, my name is Chris Weinheimer. I was hired as an assistant and translator because the actors speak only Swiss German and Jérôme Bell doesn't. His pause at this point is meant for a split second with audience uncertainty, which then becomes laughter, but only from a particular section of the audience. The laughter, at first quite uncertain, then increases and builds as more people join in. This takes place over 5 seconds, meaning the hesitancy is noticeable, or would have been noticeable, to those in the audience during the time of the performance event. Perhaps the hesitancy of the audience is to some extent influenced by the super clear enunciation of the English words by Chris Weinheimer, who sounds a bit like Werner Herzog. The deliberation of his phrasing and by the sonorous quality of his voice, amplified by the slightly reverbed settings on the sound desk, which is also equalized to accentuate the lower frequencies of his male voice. One reviewer referred to his contributions as akin to the voice of God. This may be a partial explanation for the hesitancy of the audience to laugh. If God does in fact speak English in a Swiss German accent, perhaps one would not immediately associate such a deity with a sense of humour. Perhaps the hesitance of the audience to allow themselves to laugh is also influenced by the fact that this is a piece by Jérôme Bell, and therefore at the provocative end of the contemporary performance spectrum. Or perhaps the audience are anticipating that a piece entitled Disabled Theatre, performed by intellectually disabled performers, may be in some way putting their reactions under a kind of scrutiny. The voice of God reference is also, of course, about what Chris Weinheimer says in the piece, and the fact that he speaks for Jérôme Bell, the absent deity. He continues, "The first thing Jérôme asked the actors was to enter the stage one by one and to stay in front of the audience for 1 minute. He then repeats this sentence in Swiss German as a signal to the members of Theater Horror to commence the performance. The 11 performers duly comply. One thing that does become clear in the course of this part of the performance is that 1 minute is a notional amount of time. Some of the performers stay shorter, some longer. One performer comes on rapidly, walks around the stage at pace and walks off again, all within the space of 10 seconds. Peter stays in front of the audience for a good 3.5 minutes, and it seems would happily have stayed longer were he not gently prompted to leave by Chris. Danke, Peter. Thank you, Peter. Peter exits. There are suppressed giggles in the audience. These are uncomfortable minutes. Uncomfortable for the performers, who fulfill Jérôme's instruction, but who in the glare of the lights and the gaze of the audience seem to have limited options to act, or even to be, or to stay as they were requested. What are they staying for? What can they do? Be themselves? Be disability? Some avoid the gaze of the audience, some return the gaze defensively, some make gestures with their hands, some zone out and shut their eyes, some stand back on their heels or become almost vertiginous in danger of losing their balance. These are minutes that are also uncomfortable for the audience. As the procession of 11 performers, one after the other, proceeds, the audience may well be asking what it is that is being performed. What is it that they are meant to be seeing? The variations by the performers in the approach to performing this apparently simple task are at first interesting. They are what the audience might deem to be performance, a look here, a change in stance there, but they become less and less so as the 11 performers in turn come out and have their minute on stage. How are the audience supposed to respond to the performance? How are the performers supposed to respond to the audience? Is this uncertainty or uncomfortableness or questioning of what it is that is going on in performance? Is this, in fact, the performance? Is theatre itself being disabled, reduced to a degree zero, or the kind of pure performance in itself of John Cage's 4 minutes 33? As this section of the performance proceeds, the noise of coughing, throat clearing, and seat shifting begins to increase, particularly in those times between the entrance and exit of each performer, less so when one of the performers is out on stage, perhaps out of respect for the performer's presence. Just how uncomfortable these minutes are for audience members depends on a number of factors. Their capacity for boredom, their capacity for sympathy or empathy, their familiarity or unfamiliarity with people perceived to have intellectual disabilities. Would the performance be less uncomfortable if 11 people without disabilities came out on stage and each stayed there for a minute? Assuming that there is a difference, what is the difference that disability makes? Does the audience know or assume that all 11 performers are intellectually disabled? Or do the performers become intellectually disabled by association? What if there were a ringer passing as intellectually disabled? What does intellectual disability actually look like? The term comes back to bite us. Or it comes back to bite the idea of any us, which can only be facilitated by an exclusion of a them. After the name, age and profession sequence, then Jérôme asked the actors to name their handicap. Again, there's a range of variety of responses. One performer says, "I don't know." Another, "I'm simply much too slow." Julia says, "I have Down syndrome and I'm sorry." Another woman says, "I am Mongoloid. I am a fucking Mongol. Sometimes yes, or sometimes no. I stutter a lot. It hurts me." And then she burst into tears. Peter says, "Yes, now, good theatre. Yes, now, play in theatre. Peter Haller, and the stars in the sky and the light. And I have Johnny, the stars, and dancing around and sleeping, the stars in the sky, dancing around. Johnny, Johnny." After that, Jérôme asked the actors to prepare a dance solo. Each actor chose the music and the choreography. Jérôme chose 7. We then see the 7 dance solos. Jerome Bell, the choreographer, totally abnegates his role as choreographer or director, or totally empowers the performers. Then Jérôme asks the actors what they think about this piece. I'm going to leave the last words to rest with the actors, though these words may have been different every night, and though I can't answer for what happens to these words as they pass through me. So, when Jérôme asks the actors what they think about this piece, Sarah says, special. Damian says, I think it's super that we are allowed to sit still because I practice Qigong and can meditate. My mother saw it and said that it's freak showish, but she liked it a lot. Matthias Brucker says, it is super. My parents think differently. They didn't like it. After the performance, my sister cried in the car. She said that we were like animals in the circus. Julia says, very good. I have a request, that you play for once Justin Bieber, not Michael Jackson. They do, and she dances. Peter says, yes, now it's good theatre. I realised the star and the sky and dancing and Johnny, and they play good theatre, and Ruti, and it was beautiful. We were up there with a little coffin, and he was going down in the coffin, and now he's down there. Ruti, the Benissimo lottery, and flowers, the flag of America, and Mark, he bought the flowers, water, Ruti, and Joshua, he fell, I pushed him, and yes, good theatre, the stars in the sky, and now I have this handkerchief, and I'm taking the star down. Now he's coming. Now it's coming, right down into the handkerchief, and I put it into my pocket. Thank you.
Okay, so our third and final paper is by Chris Goto-Jones, who is Professor of Comparative Philosophy and Political Thought at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And he's also there the principal researcher of the Political Arts Project. And Chris's paper is about performances that are too long. From Burden to Blaine, The Way of Endurance as Performance Philosophy.
Thank you. I do feel a bit conscious talking about endurance at the end of today. So, thank you. All right, what I want to talk about really is what's going on when someone endures in a public space. That is, when they perform their endurance in some way. And what I'd like to do, I think, is spend a little time navigating between a few choice signposts that I think set out some of the terrain that really interests me. Starting with the last, at least chronologically, the American magician and, quote, endurance artist, David Blaine, who's become famous for, amongst other things, being buried alive for 7 days in 1999, standing on a pillar in Bryant Park in New York City for 35 hours in 2002, and then rather catastrophically sitting in a plexiglass box suspended over the Thames in London for 44 days in 2003. Next is the controversial American performance artist, Chris Burden, who was famously shot through the arm by his assistant in 1971, on purpose, I should add, and then crucified on the back of a Volkswagen Beetle in 1974. Finally, we have Eric Weiss, the Hungarian-American magician and escapologist from the so-called golden age of magic at the turn of the 20th century, whom we have come to mythologize as Harry Houdini. Amongst other things, Harry Houdini was also buried alive in California in 1915, although his purpose was to escape from this rather unpleasant situation. He didn't enjoy it, and he didn't do it again. One of the things that first drew me to this material was actually a rather cynical mindset. That is, I was drawn to the performance of endurance by the question of whether the endurance was actually real, whatever that means. Are the performers who seem to be enduring actually enduring anything? This seemed to matter to me, or at least to me. If I discovered, say, that Chris Burden only pretended to be shot in the arm, like a stage magician catching a bullet in his teeth, then this seemed to transform the nature and the meaning of his performance rather profoundly. There was, or so it seemed to me, something powerfully different between, on the one hand, communicating the idea of getting shot in the arm for some reason, presumably for some reason that was itself rather powerful and important, such as perhaps art or protest against the Vietnam War in Burden's case. So on the one hand, this idea, and on the other hand, actually being shot in the arm for some reason, whatever that reason might turn out to be. I don't really care what the reasons are for our purposes today, just that there might happen to be one. Having one's assistant shoot us in the arm early one evening in California is undoubtedly an unusual way to spend your evening. It's not an unusual thing to accomplish in the pedestrian sense that not many people can do it. It's not like you have to be especially talented. Anyone can be shot in the arm, if they really want to be. But rather it's unusual precisely because the main, perhaps even the only requirement is the commitment to allowing somebody to shoot you in the arm. And we generally associate this kind of committed act with controversial performance art, since it's instantly contested by many people whether art is something that should fall into the category of things that somebody should be willing to be shot in the arm about. Or we associate it with political protest, since history is rich with and perhaps enriched by examples of individuals who have damaged or even martyred themselves for causes that seem plausibly more important than a full head of hair, an arm, or even a human life. Perhaps we associate it with insanity, whether crisis or drug-induced or deeply constitutional. Or perhaps in certain specific contexts, we might associate it with spiritual trial, attempts at transcendence or ordeal, or something like this. Now this, of course, is where David Blaine comes in. I'm not sure he's somewhere between those last two categories, I think. In the case of Blaine, it's not only that we're skeptical about whether he's really doing some of the things he performs for us, simply because it seems unlikely that anyone of normal faculty would do such things voluntarily, at least without a very good reason. I like to capitalize very good reasons, so it's VGR for future note. Very good reason. We might call this the general skepticism about endurance art. But in his case, we're also suspicious because he's known to be a stage or a street magician. And hence we're already and always alert to the possibility that we're not seeing what is really happening. We might call this the specific skepticism in the case of David Blaine. Taken together, the general and the specific are pretty formidable, and it would be an accomplishment in itself for Blaine to be able to convince us of the authenticity of his feats of endurance. Indeed, this is one of the chief differences in the context of Blaine and Burden. We seem willing to accept that Burden's acts are authentic actions because they're in the context of art. That is, we accept that art could, at least for people like Burden or perhaps Marina Abramovich, it could be a good enough reason to want to mutilate yourself. But we're less willing to accept that magic, stage magic, is such a context. So in the case of Chris Burden, the general skepticism is weaker because we're open to the possibility that art itself is a VGR. It's a very good reason to do unusual things. Even if it wouldn't be a good enough reason, perhaps for me, or maybe for you, I don't want to speak for you, to do these kind of things. And the specific skepticism is similarly weaker because we have no reason to suppose that an artist like Burden is secretly a magician seeking to deceive us, although this would be a good trick. Something to consider then is what the real difference is for the audience, since the difference for the performer, of course, is very obvious, between the appearance of endurance and endurance itself, between an endurance act and the act of endurance, if you like. What the specific skepticism regarding Blaine reveals is that the power of our experience of an endurance act is not, or at least not mainly, determined by what we actually see. The perfect illusion of being shot in the arm, indistinguishable as this may be from watching somebody actually being shot in the arm, will not be enough. Indeed, watching someone actually being shot in the arm would also fail if we were suspicious that there was a trick involved. What counts, it seems, is the audience's belief in the commitment of the performer, not necessarily what the performer is seen to do. And this is where Houdini comes in. In the spirit of his crusades against spiritualists at the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, who always operated in the unseen, Houdini very deliberately strove to reveal the unseen in order to debunk groundless beliefs. By taking his stand against the mystique of the unseen, Houdini established a space of trust that is actually rather unusual for magicians. Indeed, one of his great innovations was to bring escapology into open view. Instead of breaking out of handcuffs or struggling out of a straitjacket behind a curtain so that nobody could see how he did it, which was very normal practice at that time, he stood center stage for all to see, or he hung upside down over a crowded street in Baltimore. And in this way, he attempted thoroughly to debunk the idea that anything magical or tricksy was going on. His audience could see him struggling and wrenching his body, dislocating his joints, cutting himself, sweating copiously. It was clear to everyone that he was struggling. He was enduring this before them. And not only that, it was clear that he was going through all of this for the sake of his audiences. This was a form of entertainment heroism, if you like. Indeed, he professed merely to want to demonstrate to people of what an ordinary man is capable. He has been called America's first superhero, not because he claimed superhuman powers, but precisely because he did not. Ironically, Houdini has become a byword for modern magic, not because he conjured mysterious effects that dazzled and amazed, but because he steadfastly refused to be magical at all. He suffered and he endured on stage, fighting desperately with manacles and pain to which he had willingly submitted himself, and he did not quit until he was free, even if this meant injuring himself, sometimes extremely badly. And when he did injure himself, he tried very hard to cover it up. He didn't want anyone to know. There was no splashing of hospital trips or emergency surgeries across the press, as though to document the authenticity of his danger, since nobody doubted he was in danger. Houdini is interesting for us today, partly because of the way he transformed this space of stage magic into an authentic space of endurance art, and partly because of the commonplace assertion that David Blaine is the new Houdini, or sometimes the hip-hop Houdini. In fact, I think, Blaine is rather profoundly unlike Houdini. Indeed, I might even be tempted to call him an anti-Houdini. We might note, for instance, very superficially, that when Houdini was buried alive in a box, he was escaping from chains and a bag, and then the grave in which the box was buried. His goal was to overcome the constraints as quickly and openly as possible to demonstrate that a normal man could actually do this. The attempt caused him serious injury, which he hid from the public, but this is actually why he never repeated the trick. The stunt, I guess. When Blaine was buried alive in Trump Palace in New York in 1999, he just lay there for 7 days before somebody dug him up again. Whereupon, uninjured, he was dramatically rushed to hospital as though to confirm the danger he had been in. So on the one hand, the type of endurance attempted by Blaine is completely different from the type pioneered by Houdini. Typically, Blaine's endurance involves doing nothing. Sorry, that was a misspoke. Blaine's endurance involves doing nothing for unusually long periods, while Houdini, in similar circumstances, was unusually and explosively active for very short periods. And on the other hand, Blaine's atmosphere of action is pervaded by suspicion, by ambiguity, and by magic, while Houdini's was full, somewhat miraculously, of trust and robust mundanity. In fact, this to me is the most important difference between the two. For Houdini, the merging of an aura of magic and a practice of endurance was actually a kind of evil. He worked tirelessly to debunk performers who claimed magical powers, or spiritualists who claimed they could talk to the dead, arguing powerfully that such people are at best socially irresponsible, or at worst, cynical confidence tricksters preying on the weak and the vulnerable. And in the years of the early 20th century, this was perhaps a public service. Blaine, on the other hand, is very deliberate about cultivating a persona that blurs these lines between magic and reality. He's clear that one of his goals is to make people think about the world around them differently, to challenge their preconceptions about what is possible and impossible. And prima facie, this sounds a lot like the kind of thing Houdini said. But in practice, Blaine means the opposite. He means that he wants people to wonder whether or not he has real magical powers. And through his actions, he wants to establish the possibility of a world in which magic is real in the 21st century. So how does he go about, Blaine, he says, undermining reality in this way? His latest TV special, some of you may have seen, called Real or Magic, this is a 2013 ABC special. He sets out to showcase exactly this kind of blurring, challenging his audience to question whether he's really accomplishing what it looks like he's accomplishing. He's building directly on his earliest show, Street Magic from 1997, in which his deadpan intensity provoked remarkable responses from the people of Brooklyn. Very famously, and much to Blaine's satisfaction, a woman in that show asked him whether he was really a sage with real supernatural powers. He doesn't answer these questions, of course. Now, he didn't appear to her and to others to be performing, just doing magic, just like he might were he a real magician. One particular effect in Real or Magic that warrants a little time as we get to the end here is really an endurance act. So I'm going to explain this and I'm going to aid Karen and do some bad acting for you. Blaine sits with Ricky Gervais in a restaurant booth, takes out a long steel pin and proceeds to push it slowly and very deliberately straight through his arm. There's no fuss, there are no magic wands, no top hats, just a simple, do you see how the needle looks like it's going into my arm? Yes, says Ricky Gervais. Yes, it does. He's watching with increasing discomfort, ready for a trick, but decreasingly sure he's seeing one. This is nuts. This is not a trick. You're just sticking a fucking needle through your arm. What are you doing? Gervais prods and pokes at the arm. How is this not real? Blaine, nonplussed, then asks Gervais to pull the needle out of his arm so that he can see how it was done. This sends Gervais into new fits. This is real! This is real, you're a maniac. And in the end, Gervais sums up his experience. He stuck a needle through his fucking arm. But he couldn't have, because nobody would do that. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? But it's amazing, either way, he says. Either it was the best illusion I've ever seen close up, or he's a maniac. It's not a trick. It's a double bluff. You just did something and you want people to think it's an illusion, like your card tricks, but really, you just stuck that pin through your arm. That's brilliant. It's the best con ever, because it's not a con. It's like someone pretending to cut their own foot off, and then they hobble off without a foot. Did you see that? Didn't it look like I cut my own foot off? Space for his acts of professed endurance. So, when he sat in the plexiglass box for 44 days, suspended next to the Tower of London in London, strangely, apparently starving very slowly, the British public were convinced that this was a trick, or at least that it might be a trick, and that doubt was enough. This meant it was just an extremely long and uneventful and boring magic trick, rather than an impressive feat of endurance. Someone even tried to cut off his water supply in order to demonstrate that it was full of Gatorade. In the end, we're left with Ricky Gervais's question, which is a rephrasing of our general skepticism. Why would he do these things? And especially, why would he do them if he's aware that the very fact it's him doing them will undermine the willingness of his audience to believe he's doing them? Is this just celebrity gone mad? Now, Blaine himself has an answer to this question. He says he doesn't do these things for his audience at all, but rather that they're part of a spiritual journey. He has to do them. He wants to do them. This is a man, after all, with a shoulder-to-shoulder tattoo of Dali's crucifixion of the Christ of St. John, right across his back, and Primo Levi's concentration camp number tattooed on his right forearm. Photos are all over the internet. These are not privately guarded tattoos, these are performance tattoos. He likened his pillar stand to St. Simon of the Desert, and his starvation in the box to Kafka's hunger artist. However, given our specific skepticism about Blaine himself, it's also not clear what we should do with this dramatic and elaborately dramatized explanation or characterization. Isn't this journey rationale just another way to bolster the space of ambiguity in which he seeks to perform? Is this real to him or not? Even to the extent that it might not even matter to him whether or not his audiences believe it's real. Is he suffering this disbelief and abuse of the public as a deliberate way to heighten his spiritual quality and his endurance, like being in the stocks in front of the Tower of London? Does he want people to doubt him, so that his own resolve and commitment will be even more greatly tested? Is it, or is he, as that woman from Brooklyn once observed, a sage making his way through the trials of commercial society? Is this a giant double bluff, presenting himself as a sage magician so that people will disbelieve his endurance acts and thus provide the conditions that heighten his suffering and enhance his journey to sagehood? Is the uncertainty and the ridicule actually what he's enduring in the box above River Thames? Should we be amazed and awed that a man can survive voluntarily putting himself into the stocks, effectively, in front of the Tower of London? And is it entirely the point that we will miss the point of what he's doing? Frustratingly, of course, Blaine's endurance act provokes these questions, but very deliberately, I assume, provides no answers to them, making the affective power of his act deeply complex and rather sophisticated. His act doesn't seem to seek to replace, in the end, a rational worldview with a magical one, but leaves us radically unsure about the criteria we might use to make any sort of judgment between them. Thanks.
Thank you to all three of you. So we'll open the space, the room now for questions. Just while you're gathering your thoughts, when I was thinking about this session, I thought these are all the kind of performances that would never get ethics clearance in a university, who asked you to promise that you're not going to disturb anybody. And particularly during the last, your last talk, but also all of them, I was starting to reflect on the meaning of the words to, T-O-O, and then not enough, and the relationship of those words to authenticity, something you brought up. So, anyway, so questions. Okay, I guess I'm going to run around.
Yes, hello. This question is for Chris. Yeah, I just took a few notes about what you said, and I'm not sure if I misunderstood. But first of all, I'm not sure after listening to your talk, why is it that you mentioned Marvin with Chris Marvin along with these two musicians? And then, if I'm not mistaken, what you said about Chris Marvin, when you described his action of shooting in the shoulder, you said that the only requirement is commitment, and that anyone with normal faculties could have done that. I just want to know what you think about that, if you can explain.
I can answer this quickly. Thank you for that. It's nice to be listened to so closely. I mentioned Burden. There's a sort of bigger version of this project where Burden fills rather more of it. And I mentioned him really to demonstrate the contrast between different types of contexts in which endurance acts can take place. So for Burden, of course, he's working in one very particular art world context. And Blaine is working in a very celebrity-oriented, fame-based context, which have different kinds of imperatives and different kinds of demands. So what I'm really wanting to do there is make a demonstration that the context has very significant meaning for the way in which we interpret and give significance to the actions themselves. Also because it's very clear that Burden did do these things. And for Blaine, Burden's actually a rather significant source of inspiration. So one of the things that Blaine has done subsequently is a bullet catch, right, inspired by Burden being shot through the arm. Blaine did reproduced the very famous catching a bullet in your teeth act that notoriously has killed many magicians in the past, not incidentally because they get shot in the head by this bullet, but because the equipment that tricks you into thinking this is going to happen will malfunction sometimes, and the magician will get shot by, the empty shell or something like this, will get trapped in the chamber of the gun, or something will go wrong. Right? So there's something kind of chronically embarrassing about this, or poetically embarrassing almost about those deaths. And magicians in general have failed, or have decided never to do it again, really. So it's kind of off the books, because the audience always assumes it's a trick, but there's real danger, and the danger is not in the trick, but in these kind of accidental occurrences. So Blaine tries to recreate this, and actually does a bullet catch in his mouth that he sets up in a way that he thinks is aping Chris Burden. So he has a rifleman, an expert rifleman, a marksman, shoot a bullet into a metal cup that he's holding in his mouth. And you can watch it in a single take, just like when you can watch the Burden shot, right, in a video or online, wherever you like. And you can watch this in a single take online, where the bullet leaves the gun, goes over, hits the cup in Blaine's mouth, and falls out. Right? And he actually did this, but nobody believes he did this. And this is a remarkable thing in itself, in that contrast between Burden and Blaine, right? That Burden actually got shot in the arm, and people are very happy to believe this happened. And Blaine caught a bullet in a cup, and people don't think this happened. So there's something, that's really what I'm trying to get at, that kind of juxtaposition. The normal faculties thing, I'll stop speaking, otherwise I'll use all the question time. The normal faculties quote, I think, is slightly out of context. That what I said about normal faculties was that people of normal faculties would probably not put themselves in this situation. So it was the very good reason line, that a person of normal faculties would need a really good reason in order to put themselves voluntarily in the situation of being shot. Okay? Yeah.
Hi, thank you all very much. It's really interesting. Well, my question is also for Chris, but it's just probably because you're the last one, but it was maybe if I could speak to the question is about the affective state of discomfort that is also, part of endurance. And I just wondered, maybe, don't you think we could read Ricky Gervais as the figure of endurance?
You're talking to the microphone.
Couldn't we read Ricky Gervais as the figure of endurance as much as David Blaine? Because he's saying, why are you doing this? And it's also, why is he sitting watching him do that? I think, in terms of the gallows and all the examples, I think the endurance is to see who stopped who intervened to stop these dangerous performances.
I think that's absolutely true. That endurance is very much in the audience too. It's an endurance shock or something, right? There's a definitely seriously emotional reaction to these things. And the Ricky Gervais scene, if you guys are interested in this and you haven't seen it and you watch it, if you just type Blaine Gervais needle, it's your first hit on Google, and it's like 5-minute section, and you can see the effect. It's really interesting. So I agree entirely. But maybe these guys who are speaking also to issues of audience troubles would have something to say about this question too.
Yeah, okay, I've got a question over there.
Oh, thank you very much. Great panel. I have a question for Tony. I want to say thank you for foregrounding the kind of importance of signifying potential movement in your paper. And maybe this is something that sort of is possibly emerging from the paper, and that's I was interested in the way that you really focused on, to a certain extent, simply describing. And I think, it is a very contentious, difficult kind of phenomenon to theorize. And I'm wondering simply where, and the name that you almost simply just describe or just cite, but I think that there's a performative that's working in there, is Jerome. And I'm wondering if there's any way you maybe want to tease out, what is being performed, or what is the performative force of that citation. The whole sort of authorship / not authorship that's sort of circulating around here, etc.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I went a deliberate way just to be as non-meta as possible, to be as imminent as possible. But originally the paper was going to be about Jérôme Bel and disabled theatre, and about Ganesh versus the Third Reich by back-to-back theatre, where a very different process is undertaken by the director, Bruce Ladwin, and the performers. There was a tremendous amount of controversy over disabled theatre in all kinds of areas, and a tremendous divide and response, which I didn't really want to go into, but and particularly from the disability culture, disability studies side of performance studies, a great critique of Bell just kind of being a tourist in the land of the disabled, whereas back-to-back theatre had been working in the community and with, for about 20 years. Jérôme Bel gives a kind of, he doesn't give very much to the performers. That was it. Those exercises, that was the performance. Those exercises were originally, if we're to believe him, they were the rehearsal exercises, out of which something might be devised. But then he made the decision to make the rehearsal exercises the performance. But with back-to-back, you have an incredibly complex narrative of a Jewish person from a concentration camp being sent back in time to reclaim the swastika from the Nazis and give it back to the god Ganesh. So you have this epic narrative sweep on one level of the narrative, and then you have the other level, which is about 2/3 of the show, is about a group of disabled performers, intellectually disabled performers, and an able director working out what can or cannot be done in disability, in intellectual disability theatre. Who has the right to tell stories? Who empowers a story? Who has agency? So all of those questions are asked in that. I kind of felt like that's a big topic. It's a thesis topic rather than 20 minutes. But thank you for raising it. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Yeah, that's great.
Any other questions? Okay, it's hot in here. So let's call that the end of the session. And I think there's 15 minutes before the next one begins, so get some air. Thank you. And thank you to our speakers.